Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Van Cleff, and I am the founder and CEO of the Social Writerly. We are so excited to welcome Jaimee D. Cali, our lead fiction instructor, in a special masterclass interview. Before we dive in and talk about the scary, spooky, and creepy, I wanted to give you all a brief bio of Jaimee and her accomplishments. Jaimee D. Cali's lifelong passion is reading and writing. She received her MA in English Literature from Monmouth University. She is an adjunct professor of English at Brookdale Community College. Her work has been featured in the Monmouth Review, and her reviews of novels and poetry collections have been published in Philadelphia Stories. When Jaimee isn't reading horror, writing, or teaching, she enjoys cooking, baking, crocheting, as well as candle making. Jaimee, we are so excited to have you and talk to you about what you love the most, which is horror, I would assume, based on your
Well,
background.
thank you. I'm really happy to be here and chatting about horror. I do love horror all year round. So it's not just October season for me. It's sort of a 365 all day, every day kind of lifestyle, mixed in with a little sci-fi, fantasy, speculative fiction, mystery, and thriller.
Awesome. So, if you want to talk about your previous class was called Monsters and Monstrosity, which highlighted the fundamentals of horror and monsters, obviously. But if you wanted to talk a little bit about that and what went on in that class, that would be great.
Yeah, so this was my inaugural class here at the Social Writerly, which is like crazy that it's already over. It came and went so fast. But the class itself explored different elements of horror, really with a focus on what makes life scary, not just what makes horror scary. Because when you can isolate what is scary in life, you can really write a scary story. And so each of my students, sort of funny enough, kind of came up with their own stories first week that shared some similar themes and plot points. So they had their main characters were oddly enough the same name, and they both featured a carnival in one way or another. And I just feel like this really speaks to the universal elements of horror, which is a lot of what we discussed in class. Why are certain monsters scary? Why are certain human traits scary or dangerous? What builds suspense? How do we scare when there's no visual in front of us? It's really easy to do a jump scare in a movie. Maybe not easy, I'm sure. Let me rephrase that. It's easy for the viewer to be scared in a jump scare in a movie because everything's happening and it feels very visceral, right? You've got music and images, and you're following this character really at the same time that they're going through this experience. But when we write, there's a little bit of a difference. There's a little bit of a separation in terms of you're visualizing it in your head. So, what can we do as writers to build that suspense into the text so that every line, the reader's heart is racing a little bit faster and they're a little bit scared to turn the page because they think they know what's going to happen, but you want them to keep reading. And so that's what we talked about for 8 weeks. And it was a phenomenal first class. And I'm sorry that it's over already. I wish I could just talk forever about horror. But it was a great class. And I think everyone really enjoyed it.
Based on our reviews that we've gotten and just student testimonials, I can rest assure you that they absolutely did enjoy that class. I know that in your class you structured it around a novel. Did you want to talk about that and maybe your reasoning behind that, and why did you pick the novel that you did?
So I picked a novel instead of short stories because I really think that it's something special to have this sort of elongated scare, right? In short stories, you only get a small amount of time. And so, right from the beginning, it's sort of, like you've packed this punch. And everything needs to be scary or alluding to scary right from the very beginning. But in a novel, you have much more time to kind of go into all of the intricacies and lay out not only the foundation for what's scary, but what's also going on almost at like that dual level. So you have on the surface how we're living the characters' day-to-day lives. And then just below that is kind of like whatever horror we're experiencing, whether that be domestic, supernatural. So you get this really great context for, well, is it a scary story because there's a monster in it, or is it a scary story because of something the characters are doing? And a lot of times it's more of a mix of both. And the novel I selected, White is for Witching by Helen Oyeyemi, and I'm hoping I pronounce her name correctly because it's a marvelous novel and it's really one of my favorites. It works on so many levels. Not only are there multiple narrators, so different points of view, but the novel itself, it really speaks to the reader. You know, there's points in that novel where the one character as the house kind of says, like, I'm reading this over your shoulder with you. So it almost breaks a fourth wall, which you don't see very often in novels, as you do in some film and television now. I really also love that there's a really rich dialogue of mental health, colonization. There's intricacies in the relationships between the characters. And then separate from all of that, as if that was not plenty to feast on as you're reading, you have this wonderful blended horror story where you're not quite sure what the monster is when you get to the end. And the book kind of asks you, who do you believe? You know, is everyone a reliable narrator? Are none of them reliable? Whose story can you trust? And I think that at the end, there's plenty of scares throughout, supernatural and otherwise. But the uncertainty of not knowing who to trust, I think, is both highly relatable, because in life, there's, I think, so many situations where who do we trust? How can we trust? Is the most horrifying question we can ask of ourselves. But as a reader, you don't get that very buttoned up, okay, and now the story has come to a close and I know everything that's happened. And so I can put this down, put it aside, and rest easy. So I've read the novel, I think this is about my third or fourth time, and each time I get something very different out of the reading. And each time I think I select a different narrator to be my reliable narrator. And you get a very different story each time you read it.
Wow, that's incredible. It's like pick your own story in a way
Yes.
in this novel. That's so interesting. And what a great medium to use, especially for uh, writers of horror who may be new to the game
Mm-hmm.
or new to this genre. So they can sort of experiment on their own and sort of use this book as a guide. Say, listen, the next time I read this book, I want to follow this narrator and maybe emulate something in my own work that kind of aligns with that and what have you. So thank you so much for answering that. So what made you so interested in writing and reading horror stories? And what was your first horror story that you've read? And what made it so intriguing and scary to you?
So I think I was a little bit of a creepy kid. Not super creepy. I mean, I definitely am an emo kid at heart, but I did really love all things macabre when I was younger. I remember in, I think, middle school, I became deeply obsessed with Poe, and that it certainly hasn't ended. Still love all of his work, but yeah, I enjoyed sort of horror adjacent reading. I When I was very small, I was a big mystery book reader. I still like mysteries, but that was really when I was a kid. All I wanted to read was mysteries. I wanted to kind of see if I could figure out the ending, and I wanted like those really atmospheric settings in mysteries. So I didn't just want it to be like, you know, little suburban America and we've just got this cute little mystery to solve, who stole the cookie from the cookie jar kind of thing. I wanted it to be like gothic mansions set aside where, the only visitor is like the postman or something. And all the furniture is covered in sort of dusty linens, and there's one caretaker cook extraordinaire, doing everything sort of around the house. So I think that's where it kind of started. I sort of approached horror from this place of loving Gothic style homes and settings. And then slowly that turned into more horror. So, uh, the sound of like birds outside and foggy moors and stuff like that. That was what I wanted in my mystery novels. And when I got a little bit older and I started reading some horror, that's what I looked to the most. I want to say the first horror novel I read, and I will preface this by saying that lots of horror scared me as a kid. Goosebumps definitely scared me.
Still does.
Yes. So, which is, for a YA novels, really something to say that as adults we can still find something scary about them. But I think for me, the first horror book I read, and I'm not sure if it's 100% classified as horror, was I think it was called The Dollhouse Murders. And again, it features this sort of like creepy house, and then even creepier is this creepy dollhouse that's sort of possessed, I guess you could say. And once again, loving not only that they're obviously in a house, but then there's a house within a house.
Yeah.
And perhaps that is what kicked off my fear of vintage dolls and marionette puppets. But
I'm sure.
yeah, but I do still love like that Gothic mansion kind of trope. And symbol in setting. And I think from there, as I said, I read a lot of Poe in middle school and then in high school. And then obviously like I started reading Stephen King. And then somewhere around maybe like end of high school, early college, I became a huge Shirley Jackson fan. I read The Lottery, which is I think a lot of people's first touch points with her. And I've read so much since. We've Always Lived in the Castle is one of my favorites by her. I just, again, the house and the ways in which we get trapped in our houses, even if it's not by some supernatural ghost. The Haunting of Hill House, of course, classic, quintessential. But I think that there's something wonderful about what we can do with this idea of like a modern haunted house. We're not all living in Dracula's castle, but what is scary at home?
That's so interesting. And this wasn't on my list of questions, but this sort of kind of dives into the next one that I have in my head going on. What do you think is the deal with horror and homes? Because I know in our other class we did place and space, which has a lot to do with home. Uh, but that kind of concept also can be integrated into horror. So why do you think that is? And uh, how have you integrated that into your own writing?
So I'm so happy you asked me this because when I was doing my master's, I became a little obsessed with the various meanings and importance and ways in which the home factors into our daily lives, personal and professional. But for a short answer, I'll say that I think that homes are so prominent in horror because some of the scariest things that can ever happen to us happen at home. And, I think about, I think that there's obviously lots of joy in childhood. But I think that childhood's also a super scary time, and you spend so much of that time at home. Um, and
Interesting.
so I think that that connection starts really early on. And I'm not a psychologist, so I am just speaking purely from literary / personal experience uh, kind of place. But I do think that there's this idea that like there's safety in home, but when something goes wrong in home and when safety is inaccessible in your home, it's perhaps the most horrific thing you can experience in life. So I
That's so
think that
interesting.
kind of duality there, where like home is supposed to be where you are safe and loved and, needs are taken care of. But at the same time, it can be just the opposite of that. Or it could be too much of that. So you can have this idea that like you're trapped in your home due to certain roles or duties or requirements. So Yeah, so I think the home, I think that all horror somehow focuses on something we experienced in life. Because that's what's scary, right? That's what we know. That's how we can all connect to horror, even if it's not something we've experienced before. And so the fact that houses and homes are so prominently featured really says that there's a lot to be said about the home space. And I could go down a very lengthy rabbit hole right now. But there's also different roles that the home can play. You have it's, I think nowadays looked at as a very private space, but there's also public elements to it. So there's this idea that even at home, again, where you're supposed to be safe and loved and all needs are met, there's still spaces in the home where you might wear some of those masks that you take outside with
Hmm,
you. I think
interesting.
that's interesting too. And I don't want to go into a whole sort of master's thesis dissertation, but I think there's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
Um, and definitely so much to read in terms of what's available on the market for books. So many novels feature a home as either a very prominent setting or even a character itself.
Maybe you can give us a list, and we could put it up on our website
Yeah.
for people who would be interested in these kinds of books, because this is a really interesting avenue to go down in terms of horror. I mean, people are avid horror movie watchers, especially at this time of year. Um, but maybe sometimes we don't think about the role in which home is also one of these monsters as well, and within this genre. So this is so interesting to me. I want to talk about what your favorite horror story is and why, and what haunts you. We're going to talk about a little bit about your masterclass in reference to that. But what story has haunted you, even though you love this genre so much?
So it's such a difficult question. It's really, I feel like English majors especially hate this question because
Yeah.
one, there's so many books to love, but I think the book I come back to the most often in terms of what would I reread is either White is for Witching, obviously, because I did it in my first class and I've read it a few times. But uh, The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, and probably The Shining by Stephen King. The Shining for me, and again, it's a hotel, but it's a hotel that they're using as their home. So that's an
Hmm.
interesting conversation too. And what are
Yeah.
hotels but homes away from home?
Interesting.
Not again to dive down that rabbit hole, but just some food for thought. But that to me is like quintessential horror. Um, there's so much that is scary but not scary. You get all of like the spine tingling, fast heart rate, do I turn the page kind of feelings when reading the novel. And then there are certain scenes in the book that I think to this day I still have like a little bit of fear when I'm doing something
Hmm.
where I'm like, oh, is should I check the bathtub? Nobody's in there, but maybe I should. I'll just check it. It's
Yes.
fine. It's better if I do than I don't. Um,
Yeah.
and I think especially a book that once you've read it, you know what to expect. The jump scares aren't as scary anymore. But for a scene to kind of for a scene in a novel to stay with you after you've read it, I think is very unique and not as common in horror writing as it is in films, again because of like the visual aspect. So that to me is it's wonderfully paced, it's got fantastic suspense and storytelling, and again it's a home away from home kind of feel, so lots to go wrong there. And literally in the title, The Haunting of Hill House, that one for me is, it's almost like you're so close to it being scary and it never gives you like 100% of the jump scare. And it's almost like that's scarier
Yeah.
because you don't get like the relief of, oof, that's over, it happened.
It
Um,
just keeps going.
it keeps going. And there's a lot to be discussed in that. I think it's technically maybe a novella. But in terms of what is actually happening in this house, um and is it is it gender roles, is it societal pressures, is it an actual haunting, um is it the sort of pressure to be a certain type of woman, who would want
Mm.
to live in a house like that. um you don't know. There's no answer at the end, and I think that's really horrifying, especially as a woman, to not have answers at the end and
Yeah.
to just be left with a lot of questions and a lot of scenes that maybe aren't scary by our standards today in terms of when you're reading, horror, but are certainly scary in a day-to-day real life kind of conversation.
For sure. Absolutely. I wanted to just ask a quick question about these two books because they were converted into movies and I think
Mm-hmm.
a good TV series, right? Haunting you.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it was a movie. I'm not sure. It was
It's
on
both.
Netflix. What is your take on that? And have they kind of checked all the boxes for you in terms of storytelling?
So I'll do The Shining first because that's where I started before. So Stanley Kubrick's film is a fantastic film. And there's certainly lots of jump scares and other places to be scary. It's not necessarily a faithful adaptation in which we think that what's happening on the page is going to just be magically through filmmaking translated onto the screen. It is very much Stanley Kubrick's vision of The Shining. So it's his story that he's using The Shining as a vehicle for. But fantastic acting. Again, plenty of scenes in that film that stay with me, even having watched much scarier movies.
Mm,
The twins in particular from that film
yes. And
are,
that elevator scene is like the
yes.
scariest.
You can't, that's an image that you can't get rid of. It's not Stephen King's The Shining, but I think that it has its own interesting, unique perspective. And then Haunting of Hill House, actually, it had an older movie adaptation that was done in black and white that's very faithful, and I think through interesting filmmaking kind of highlights some of the horror that was a little bit more subtle in the novel. There's
Hmm.
a newer movie adaptation, and I can't remember who's in it, but there's a couple bigger names that was not, in my opinion, as good as maybe the black and white film. And then I guess, like the mini series or the TV series on Netflix. And that's another really fantastic example of taking a piece of literature, piece of writing, and using it as a vehicle for another conversation. Shirley
Interesting.
Jackson's, because it's at times a little bit vaguer where you're not really sure what the haunting is. Um, but surely something must be haunting Hill House because it's in the title.
Yes.
I think that the the Netflix adaptation is really interesting because it's this deep exploration of grief throughout, and I do think that they do a good job of taking what Shirley Jackson has on the page and what's a little bit there. I mean, there's definitely moments of some grief in the novel, and kind of using Hill House as this new avenue, this vehicle for a slightly different story that sort of features the same cast of characters with a little bit of a twist. Definitely more haunting in the Netflix series. I think somebody counted like there's over 40 or 50 ghost sightings or something if you go through and can actually watch all the episodes without keeping your eyes closed. But so I do think that that's a beautiful adaptation, and I think that the story it tells about grief is wonderful, and I think that there is so much to explore in Hill House that there are plenty of other conversations that could be turned into film or television.
Wow, that's amazing. I have not read or watched. I'm the opposite of you, Jaimee, where I am afraid of goosebumps. But I was just telling you before our call that I did watch Halloween for the first time last night, which led us to a brief conversation about Michael Myers.
Mhm.
Um, so I wanted to talk to you about what your favorite monster is, because now he's haunting me, even though I no, because I've only watched it once, and I know that there's more to come in that series.
Mhm.
But if you wanted to talk about your favorite monster and what again haunts you in terms of character.
Yes. So including film, television, and books, Michael Myers is my favorite like horror villain, if you will. I think that in the original, it's such a classic, clean. There's not. He is the full embodiment, the full personification of evil, and so he doesn't need to rationalize why he does anything, and he doesn't. He doesn't speak. In fact, he hasn't spoken since, what was he, like 5 or
Yeah.
something at the beginning. And so this idea that the villain doesn't have like his sort of that serial killer prerogative monologue at the end where I do this because of this, and maybe you should sympathize with me. There's no sympathy for Michael Myers. Everyone is rooting for him to lose. And it's interesting because I think as we've gone along, we do tend to find these more complex villains that, is the monster really the monster of the story? You get that a little bit with Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster. Who is the true monster there? But there's no question that it's Michael Myers. And so that is one of those stories that the film itself doesn't, I've seen it enough times. Occasionally a jump scare might catch me off guard if I'm not 100% paying attention, but the movie itself isn't what scares me. It's that idea that Michael Myers is lurking down all of these beautiful tree-lined suburban streets, and that he's hiding in any one of our neighbors or people we see in a grocery store. There's that very brief moment right at the end where his mask comes off. And that's what stops him from strangling Lori at the top of the stairs, because he's got to fix his mask. Which again, another great conversation about masks in that movie, and what we put on to go out in the world. But this idea that he looked so normal. If you had passed him in the street, I
Yes.
hate that word normal because it's like, what is normal? But he doesn't look. There's nothing about him that you would be like, oh my, like that seems to be somebody who, like he's
He
got like
wasn't even that
crazy
bad
eyes.
looking either. Like I was
No, he's just like a very average, like 20 something year old, I've 30 something year old. I forget like what his exact
I
age
think
would
he's
be.
21.
Yeah. He's just like a very average looking person who, if you're behind him in line at the grocery store, you wouldn't think twice. And like that's what's scary, because monsters, Dracula and vampires and werewolves, things that are not human, except for creepy dolls, because those kind of look human. So maybe that's a little bit different, but things that aren't human are very easy to identify as like a potential danger or threat.
Yeah.
Um, if you see a giant 7 foot tall dog, you're like, oh wow, that's a werewolf. I should not be here. Something in your brain clicks. But a monster like Michael Myers is all internal, and you don't know the dangers of what they present until you're in that situation. So that is probably my favorite. Although I do have a deep love for vampire stories and vampire myth. I think that again early on I was a huge Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan, the TV show. Again, very dark little soul of a child. But so I love all of those different types of monsters and things that go bump in the night. And I like that there's a lot of complexity to the lore, and different ways that we've seen them represented both in books and in films and television. But yeah, definitely if I had to be scared of one person jumping out of my bushes, or one thing that might jump out, it would be Michael Myers. That would be the one that I'd be like, oh no, this is really bad.
Yeah.
And he
I
doesn't
mean,
have, I'm going to run, but he doesn't have to run and he'll still catch up to me.
watching it, and the evolution of
Mhm.
horror over the years, from Halloween. Halloween was
Mhm.
probably one of the first, I don't know, I would say pop culture classics of horror, I would say, in my opinion. And as time has gone on, it's become a little bit more gory, and less
Yes.
psychological in a sense. And so, do you think that the modern, I guess, contemporary horror has held on to this tradition of horror, that it was the traditional horror
So
today?
I think that horror has always been, and this is even like if we go way back, like to the origins of horror in terms of like what myths are driving our horror stories. So like way back before we're talking about like written horror stories when vampires were like Eastern European myths and things like that. I think that it's always been a self-reflection of society and
Hmm.
the things that we're scared of in society. And so it's evolved, I think, away from maybe these more, we'll call them classic horror stories, perhaps, where you get like the Michael Myers or the Jason or something like that. But it's always at its core sort of a conversation between the audience and the filmmakers about how they want to present society and what they're scared of in society. Um, and then you get into more of even like a meta sort of conversation when we get to like the late 90s with the Scream franchise, which is in some respects a love letter to horror. It's films that are really championing what horror is and what it does and the mechanics of why horror works, while also crafting its own very unique. I mean, I would probably say that Laurie Strode and Sydney Prescott, if I had to have like a final girl end of the world battle team, I want both of them on my team.
I love
And then you
that.
get even more current with Jordan Peele films, which I feel like are a great blend of what we love about some classic elements versus what we're mixed with, rather, a lot of social commentary and a lot of self reflection. So I think as horror has developed and become a bit more mainstream, I think horror in the late 70s and 80s really pushed it into mainstream where it wasn't just sort of B movies or super fond Bela Lugosi's old Dracula films, this like very charming, charismatic vampire. But as it came more into the mainstream, where these were box office hits, I think that we were able to sort of amplify what those earlier films were doing. So there's more social commentary. Not every horror film, of course, but I think most nowadays do that really well.
Definitely. And kind of going back to, we can have a forever conversation
I
about this. There are
know.
so many avenues, when it comes to horror. I've been writing down all of these really interesting ideas in which I want to have more conversations with you about them, like women in horror. That was something that I would love to really dive down, and maybe in another conversation we could absolutely do that. But for your next class, you're going to be diving in for your master class
Mm-hmm.
on October 26th, ghost stories,
Yes.
and how that it sort of haunts us. The haunting, it's called, ghost stories for the everyday.
Mm-hmm.
Um, how these ghost stories haunt us every day.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to dive in, talk about how you came up with that idea, and what will students expect in this master class?
Yes. So, and again, just a dark little soul, but like enveloped in a little ray of sunshine. I don't know. One of those people, I guess. But I think that there's traditional ghosts, like my mug suggests.
Casper, right?
Yeah, like
Are we going to be
there's
talking about Casper in the ghost story class? I'm in.
I mean, I do love Casper. It's a great film, great stories. But so there's traditional ghosts in this idea of, like how what happens to our energy and stuff like that after we pass on. Does something linger? What happens if it gets trapped? Who you gonna call? Kind of thing. But then I think for this class, what personally I am most intrigued by is our own personal ghosts and the things that haunt us in our life, not because you have a ghost in your attic or your great aunt lives in your kitchen, or grandma's in your guest bathroom. But what in our lives kind of keeps coming back to us? What is sort of like that dark little shadow behind us that we can't get rid of? And so we each are haunted in our own way, in very personal ways, by it could be a single event or action or a series of events, a bad decision, really anything. And it could be an experience. You might have had a ghostly experience and this is haunting you. But I think that there's also something much more, not to sound odd, but like down to earth about the sorts of ghosts we're talking about here. And so kind of looking at what's haunting us and then how to turn that into a piece of fiction. If I think the thing that haunts me most is my laundry that never fully gets put away week after week. I put it away and it comes back. There's more of it. And how might that become a story? But I think that this is what horror does. It's examining those little seemingly mundane sometimes pieces of our day-to-day life and figuring out, well, what's scary about this? Is there something scary about this? And is this something that other people might find scary too? I'm almost certain that other people are haunted by their laundry, but
I'm sure I am.
sure, yes. But
It always seems to come back in
it
little piles, and I'm like,
it
"What's
does.
happening?"
It does. It's always lurking in the corner there. But there's so many other things that we'll be discussing in terms of past experiences, past decisions, and if it's lingering and lumbering in your day-to-day life, maybe writing about it, not my laundry, of course, but something else will help move it along onto its next stage of being.
That's a great answer, especially as somebody who also like teaches students composition. And I'm sure a lot of people have the fear of
Mhm.
even talking about themselves. So putting their fears or their hauntings
Mhm.
um, into a fiction piece will probably make it a little bit more approachable. So I'm really excited for that class. I'm going to actually sign up for it myself and see, what kind of ghosts are lingering in my imagination. Um, my last and final question for you, what would you recommend to writers who are just starting out writing horror or are movie buffs, but want to see if they can try their hand at writing their own horror story? And what elements of horror would you recommend would be the place to start?
So if you are looking to start writing, it's a very common answer, but it's true. Read all the horror you can find, read different types of horror, read psychological horror, read monster horror, read YA horror. Read all the horror you can find, read all the gothic or neo-gothic novels you can find, even thriller or suspense novels. Read things that are going to scare you so you can learn what scares broader audiences. And that goes for watching too. You can absolutely watch film and TV series and see how, or see what they portray as scary, so you can get some ideas. But that's the big one. And then for me, for my opinion, suspense is the lifeblood of horror. It doesn't, I don't want to say it doesn't matter what you write about, because of course it does. It's very personal, but um, you don't have to have the scariest monster in the bunch or in the patch, or I don't know how to make that punny and cute, but you don't have to have the scariest monster. But if you can write really suspenseful moments and if you can build tension in what you're writing, that's what Michael Myers is. He's just it's just tension and suspense. He's in a kind of weird mask. It's not, I wouldn't call it horrific. Not one I would
They
want to wear, and
they
a
used the
mechanic's jumpsuit.
they used the Captain Kirk mask and
Yes.
they painted it
Yep.
white.
Yep.
So
So, he's in very mundane kind of outfit, but he's horrifying. And it's because of the suspense and the tension. In The Shining, and this is such a brilliant technique by Stephen King, and really where you see that sort of master of horror kind of title coming in. But there's this recurring element of a boiler in the basement. And the boiler, at the beginning of the novel, when they arrive, they get told how to tend to it and what the danger level is. Because boilers run the risk of becoming overpressurized, I think is the problem, and exploding. So there's
yes.
obviously like an extreme risk to personal harm, injury, death. And so throughout the novel, slowly, the boiler's fine. And then, the boiler's a little bit of tension. That needle is moving. And as the boiler continues, the more pressure the boiler begins to build until you're in that red zone where it can't take it anymore. So is the tension in the novel with all of the characters. So
Mm,
you're constantly being reminded that things are getting worse. No matter how you look at it, the boiler is not being tended. That stress point is coming. And we just don't know what happens when it finally explodes. I mean, if you've read the novel, you do. But so having this idea that there's constant tension rising, that's
interesting.
what I think drives great horror. So you don't have to come up with, you absolutely can craft really interesting, fun monsters. And I think that is some fantastic research if that's the sort of horror you want to write. And you can write about classic horror monsters. You can write about monsters that you kind of create your own of. But there's nothing scarier than that suspense, than that, do I want to turn the page? So you don't have to have an 8-legged lizard werewolf vampire person to do that. You can just have the
Michael Myers.
Michael Myers, the man in the mask. And that mask doesn't have to be literal. That's the cool thing about writing, is that we do get to do a little bit more than you can do on screen, because you have all of the words and you have all that time and the intimacy with the reader.
That's incredible. I'm so looking forward to this master class. Thank you so much, Jamie, for this interview. It was so insightful, inspiring, and I'm sure that our viewers are going to love it. Where can we find you? And how can we sign up for the master class?
So you can find me on Instagram at Jaimee right now. And we can add that when we post this, we can tag me in it and stuff. And so you'll see all different kinds of book recommendations and really bad reels, but I promise I'm getting better. So you can find me there, and I give lots of book recommendations and things like that. And then the masterclass itself, if you go on the Social Writerly's webpage, which I believe is just thesocialwriterly.com, under events, my masterclass is there. Shameless plug, Sarah's masterclass is also there in December. More to come on that later.
Yes, more
But
to come on that.
yes, but you can join me. I think it is a fantastic way to get in the Halloween spirit leading into the weekend of Halloween. So if you're looking for a little haunting content, come join me on Thursday, October 26th.
Great. Well, thank you again so much, Jamie. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm looking forward to being part of your masterclass.
Oh, thank you. It was so wonderful to chat with you for a little bit about spooky, scary, creepy things.
Yes. And I will see you then.